They laughed at him like he was already a ghost. In a boardroom glowing with ambition and cruelty, Samuel Ortiz became the punchline, his 67 years reduced to a joke whispered between expensive smiles. But when the CEO's daughter's car flipped on Lakeshore Drive, flames licking through the shattered frame, the mocked old driver became the only thing standing between Emily Darrow and a terrible ending. They mocked the old driver, but he saved the CEO's daughter from the crash. Subscribe now to witness the moment shame turns to fire and a forgotten man writes his name in courage. The ballroom of the Chicago Regency Hotel shimmered with the kind of light that made everything feel important, even when it wasn't. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above tables dressed in white linen, each one surrounded by men and women whose clothes cost more than Samuel Ortiz earned in a month. He stood near the back wall, his hands folded behind him, his posture straight despite the ache in his lower back that had been his companion for the last decade. The corporate meeting was a celebration of quarterly profits, a gathering where executives congratulated themselves on numbers that Samuel didn't fully understand, but knew represented success he would never taste. He wore his driver's uniform, the navy blazer and grey slacks pressed with care that morning, but here, in this room, the uniform felt like a costume that no longer fit. His reflection in the polished marble columns showed a man whose face had been carved by time, deep lines around the eyes, silver threading through what remained of his hair, and a quiet resignation that lived in the set of his mouth. Lucas Brandt stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne tilted in his hand like a scepter, his laughter sharp and confident. At 29, Lucas embodied everything the world seemed to reward: youth, ambition, a jawline that appeared sculpted for magazine covers. He was the CFO of Darrow Industries, a title he wore with the ease of someone who had never doubted his place in the hierarchy. Samuel watched as Lucas gestured toward the older man with a smirk that made the nearby executives lean in, their curiosity piqued. The words came through the din of conversation, like stones thrown into still water, each one sending ripples that spread and multiplied. Samuel couldn't hear the exact phrasing, but he saw the way Lucas glanced in his direction, the way the younger man's mouth curled upward, and he understood immediately that he was the subject of whatever joke was being told. The laughter that followed was bright and merciless, a chorus of voices that seemed to fill every corner of the ballroom, and Samuel felt his chest tighten as though the air had been sucked from the room. He had been a driver for Darrow Industries for 32 years, ferrying executives to meetings, waiting in parking garages and airport lounges, his presence so constant it had become invisible. Samuel had never asked for recognition, had never expected his name to be spoken with reverence or even mild interest, but he had also never imagined that his existence would be a source of amusement. The mockery wasn't new. He had felt it before in the way younger employees glanced past him as though he were part of the furniture, in the way his suggestions were met with polite nods that meant nothing, but tonight it felt sharper, more deliberate. Lucas's voice carried across the room again, something about old dogs and new tricks, and the laughter swelled once more, a wave that crashed over Samuel and left him standing in its wake, silent and small. He thought about walking out, about slipping through the service door behind him and disappearing into the Chicago night. But he didn't. He stayed because leaving would confirm what they already believed, that he was irrelevant, that his time had passed. Emily Darrow sat at a table near the front, her posture elegant but distant, as though she were present in body but not in spirit. At 24, she carried herself with the poise of someone raised in boardrooms and country clubs, her dark hair pulled into a low bun, her dress a shade of midnight blue that seemed to absorb the light around her. She was the CEO's daughter, a title that came with expectations and scrutiny, and tonight she looked as though she wanted to be anywhere but here. Samuel had driven her to events like this before, had opened car doors for her and listened to her quiet thank yous, but he had never spoken to her beyond the polite exchanges their roles demanded. Now, as he watched her from across the room, he saw the way her gaze drifted toward the windows, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the stem of her untouched wine glass. And he recognized something in her expression that mirrored his own, a longing to escape, to be somewhere that didn't require performance or pretense. The CEO, Richard Darrow, stood at the podium delivering a speech about growth and innovation. His voice deep and commanding, each word measured and deliberate. He was a man who had built an empire through relentless focus and calculated risks, and his presence dominated the room in a way that made even the most powerful executives seem diminished. Samuel had driven Richard for years, had witnessed the man's highs and lows, the late-night phone calls barked into the back seat, the moments of silence that stretched for entire city blocks. Richard was not cruel, but he was not warm either. He existed in a world where people were assets to be managed, and Samuel had long accepted that he was simply another cog in the machine. Yet tonight, as Richard spoke of legacy and the future, Samuel felt a strange disconnect, as though the words were meant for everyone in the room, except him. His future, if it could even be called that, was a slow fade into irrelevance, a quiet retirement that no one would notice or mourn. When the speech ended and the applause rose like a tide, Samuel turned toward the service corridor, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the evening. He had learned long ago not to dwell on slights, not to let the words of others carve too deeply into his sense of self, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the mockery had an audience, and the audience had laughed. As he walked through the narrow hallway that led to the parking garage, the sound of the ballroom faded behind him, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of his own footsteps. He thought about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, the roads he had traveled that had led him here, to this moment, where he was a punchline in someone else's story. He thought about the face he had failed to save years ago, the one that still visited him in dreams, and he wondered if tonight's humiliation was simply the universe's way of reminding him that some men are destined to be forgotten. Lucas Brandt stood surrounded by a small circle of admirers, their laughter punctuating his anecdotes like applause at a well-rehearsed performance. He held his champagne glass with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no, his other hand resting in the pocket of his tailored suit, and his smile was the kind that looked warm from a distance but revealed its coldness up close. Samuel had seen that smile before, had watched it flash across boardrooms and conference calls, and he understood that it was a weapon disguised as charm. Lucas's eyes swept the ballroom as he spoke, cataloguing reactions, measuring influence. And when they landed on Samuel standing near the back wall, they lingered for just a moment too long. The pause was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement that the older man had been the subject of discussion, and Samuel felt the heat rise in his face, not from anger, but from the deep shame of being reduced to entertainment for people who would never understand what it meant to work for decades without recognition. The executives around Lucas leaned in as he launched into another story. This one about a driver who had allegedly gotten lost on the way to an important meeting, causing a minor crisis that was resolved only through Lucas's quick thinking. Samuel knew the story was embellished, that the truth had been stretched and reshaped to fit the narrative Lucas wanted to tell, but no one in the circle questioned it. They laughed at the punchline, their faces bright with the easy cruelty of people who had never been on the receiving end of such jokes, and Samuel felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle over him like a shroud. He had spent his entire career being unseen, moving through the world as a shadow that facilitated the lives of others, and he had made peace with that role. But tonight it felt unbearable. The laughter wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been dismissed, every life deemed unworthy of attention, and the sound of it was a chorus of indifference that echoed through the ballroom and into the hollow spaces of his chest. Emily Darrow watched the scene unfold from her table, her expression unreadable. She had been raised in rooms like this, had learned to navigate the politics of wealth and power with the grace of someone born into it. But tonight she felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical thing. Her father's speech had been polished and inspiring, full of the kind of rhetoric that made investors lean forward and employees feel momentarily valued. But it had also felt empty, a collection of words designed to manipulate rather than connect. She had heard variations of the same speech her entire life, and each time it left her feeling more distant from the world her father inhabited. Now, as she watched Lucas command the attention of the room, she felt a flicker of something that might have been anger or might have been sorrow. It was hard to tell anymore. She had seen the way Lucas's gaze had shifted toward the older driver, had noticed the way the laughter had surged in response to whatever story he was telling, and she felt a pang of discomfort that she couldn't quite name. Samuel's memory drifted to a moment from decades earlier, a scene that played in his mind with the clarity of a film reel that had been watched too many times. He had been younger then, his hands steadier, his back straighter, and he had been driving through a rainstorm on a highway outside the city when he saw the car ahead of him lose control. The vehicle had spun across 2 lanes before slamming into the guardrail, and Samuel had pulled over without thinking, his body moving on instinct rather than deliberation. He had run through the rain to the wreckage, had pried open the crumpled door, and had found a woman trapped inside, her face pale and her breathing shallow. He had stayed with her, had held her hand, and told her she was going to be okay. But the ambulance had arrived too late, and she had died there in the twisted metal, with Samuel's words still hanging in the air. The memory haunted him, not because he had failed to save her, but because no one had ever known he had tried. There had been no recognition, no article in the paper, no moment of acknowledgement, just the quiet knowledge that he had been there, and it hadn't been enough. The laughter in the ballroom pulled Samuel back to the present, and he realized that Lucas was still talking, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a practiced storyteller. The younger man's confidence was both impressive and infuriating, the kind of self-assurance that came from never having to question one's place in the world. Samuel thought about all the years he had spent behind the wheel, all the conversations he had overheard, the deals brokered in the back seat, the crises averted, the lives made easier by his steady presence, and he wondered if any of it had mattered. He wondered if, when he was gone, anyone would remember his name, or if he would simply become another forgotten face in the long history of people who had served without fanfare. The thought was not bitter, it was simply true, a recognition of the way the world worked. And Samuel had learned long ago not to fight against truths he could not change. Emily's phone buzzed in her clutch, and she glanced at the screen to see a message from a friend asking if she wanted to leave early and grab a drink somewhere quieter. She typed a quick response, her fingers moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had sent 1,000 similar texts, and then she slipped the phone back into her bag. She looked around the ballroom one more time, at the faces flushed with champagne and ambition, at the chandeliers casting their golden light over a scene that felt both grand and hollow. And she felt the familiar pull of restlessness that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. She didn't belong here, not really, even though this was the world she had been born into. She belonged somewhere else, in a place she hadn't yet found, and the ache of that longing was a quiet hum beneath the surface of her polished exterior. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress, and made her way toward the exit, her departure so subtle that most people didn't even notice she had left. The night air hit Emily like a reprieve, cool and clean against her skin after the stifling warmth of the ballroom. She stepped out onto the hotel's grand entrance, where valets moved with practiced efficiency and black sedans lined the circular drive like obedient sentinels. The city hummed around her, a symphony of distant traffic and muted conversations, and she felt her shoulders relax for the first time all evening. Behind her, the doors of the Regency swung shut, cutting off the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, and she was grateful for the barrier, however temporary. She pulled her phone from her clutch and checked the time. It was just past 10, late enough to justify leaving without causing a scene, but early enough that the streets were still alive with people seeking their own versions of escape. She thought about calling her friend, about meeting up for that drink, but the idea of more conversation, more performance, felt exhausting, and she decided instead to drive herself home, to let the silence of the car be her only companion. Her vehicle was parked in the hotel's underground garage, a silver sedan that her father had insisted she take instead of the sportier convertible she had wanted. Richard Darrow believed in practicality over indulgence, at least when it came to his daughter, and the sedan was his way of ensuring she remained grounded, though Emily often felt that grounding was just another word for control. She descended the concrete steps into the garage, her heels clicking against the hard surface, the echo bouncing off the low ceilings in a rhythm that felt both lonely and familiar. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale, sickly glow, and the air smelled faintly of exhaust and damp concrete, a stark contrast to the perfumed elegance of the ballroom. She found her car in its assigned spot, unlocked the door with a press of her key fob, and slid into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut with a satisfying thud that sealed her inside her own small world. The drive from downtown Chicago to her apartment in Lincoln Park usually took about 15 minutes, depending on traffic, and tonight the streets were cooperative, the lights turning green just as she approached, as though the city itself wanted her to reach her destination without delay. Emily merged onto Lakeshore Drive, the expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out to her right, dark and infinite under the night sky. She loved this stretch of road, the way it curved along the water's edge, the way the city lights reflected off the surface like scattered diamonds. It was one of the few places in Chicago where she felt like she could breathe, where the demands of her last name and the expectations of her father's world seemed to fall away, leaving only the simplicity of the road ahead and the steady hum of the engine beneath her. She turned on the radio, letting the music fill the silence, and for a moment she felt something close to peace. But peace, Emily had learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by forces beyond her control. She didn't see the oil slick on the road until it was too late, a dark patch that blended into the asphalt and betrayed no warning. Her tires hit the slick surface at 50 miles per hour, and suddenly the car was no longer hers to command. The vehicle lurched sideways, the steering wheel spinning uselessly in her hands, and she felt the sickening weightlessness of losing traction, of being carried by momentum rather than intention. She pumped the brakes, her body moving on instinct, but the tires only slid further and the car began to rotate, the world outside the windows turning into a blur of lights and darkness. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously, each second feeling like an eternity, and yet passing too quickly for her mind to fully process what was happening. She heard herself gasp, a sharp intake of breath that was more reflex than conscious thought, and then the car struck the guardrail with a force that sent shockwaves through her entire body. The impact was catastrophic. The sedan flipped, the world inverting as metal screamed against concrete and glass shattered in 1,000 glittering shards. Emily's body was thrown against the seatbelt, the strap cutting into her chest and shoulder, holding her in place even as the car continued its violent roll. The airbags deployed with explosive force, slamming into her face and filling the cabin with a chemical smell that burned her nostrils. She tasted blood, felt the sharp sting of cuts opening on her arms and forehead, but the pain was distant, muffled by the adrenaline flooding her system. The car came to rest upside down, the roof compressed and the windows blown out, and for a moment there was only silence, a stunned pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. Emily hung suspended by the seatbelt, her arms dangling toward the crumpled roof, and she tried to move, to assess the damage, but her body wouldn't respond. She felt heavy, disconnected, as though her mind and limbs were no longer speaking the same language. Then she smelled the smoke. It started as a faint wisp, almost invisible, but within seconds it thickened into something tangible, something that coiled through the cabin like a living thing. Emily's heart, which had been pounding since the moment she lost control, now kicked into overdrive, and she felt the cold grip of panic tighten around her chest. She reached for the seatbelt buckle, her fingers clumsy and uncooperative, and when it finally released, she dropped onto the crumpled roof with a jarring thud that sent fresh waves of pain through her ribs. She tried to crawl toward the broken window, but the space was too tight, the metal too twisted, and every movement felt like pushing against an immovable weight. The smoke grew denser, filling her lungs and making her cough, each breath a struggle that left her lightheaded and disoriented. She heard the crackle of flames somewhere behind her, felt the heat beginning to build, and she realized with a clarity that cut through the haze of shock that she was trapped, and the car was burning, and no one knew she was here. Her phone had been thrown from her clutch during the crash, and she couldn't see it anywhere in the wreckage. She called out, her voice hoarse and weak, but there was no one nearby to hear her, no passerby to notice the overturned car on the side of Lakeshore Drive. The flames grew louder, their hunger undeniable, and Emily felt tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood and smoke residue that coated her skin. She thought about her father, about the speech he had given just an hour earlier, about the way he had talked about legacy and the future, and she wondered if this was how her story would end, not in some grand gesture or meaningful moment, but in a twisted piece of metal on a dark stretch of road, alone and forgotten. The thought was unbearable, and she pushed it away, focusing instead on the simple act of breathing, of staying conscious, of refusing to let the smoke and the fear take her under. But with each passing second, the hope that someone might come, that someone might see, grew thinner and more fragile until it felt like nothing more than a whisper against the roar of the flames. Samuel Ortiz had left the hotel through the service entrance, avoiding the main lobby where the executives still lingered, their laughter spilling into the Chicago night like champagne overflowing a glass. He walked through the parking garage with his hands in his pockets, his head down, and his mind replaying the evening's events in slow motion, each mocking glance and sharp laugh etched into his memory with painful clarity. He reached his own car, a 15-year-old sedan that had served him faithfully but bore the scars of time, rust spots along the wheel wells, a crack in the windshield that had been there for so long he barely noticed it anymore, and an engine that coughed before starting as though clearing its throat. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and listened to the familiar sputter before the engine caught and settled into a steady idle. Driving had always been his refuge, the one place where he felt competent and in control, and tonight he needed that feeling more than ever. He pulled out of the garage and onto the streets of downtown Chicago, navigating the grid of traffic lights and late-night pedestrians with the ease of someone who had driven these roads thousands of times. The city was beautiful at night, the skyscrapers lit up like monuments to ambition, their glass facades reflecting the glow of streetlights and neon signs. Samuel had always loved Chicago, had raised his children here, had built a life within its borders, but tonight the city felt different, colder, as though it had turned its back on him along with everyone else. He drove without a clear destination, letting muscle memory guide him. and eventually found himself heading north on Lakeshore Drive, the dark expanse of Lake Michigan stretching out to his left like an infinite void. The road was relatively empty at this hour, just a scattering of cars moving at steady speeds, and Samuel felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease as the miles rolled past beneath his tires. He was thinking about retirement, about the small house he had been saving for in a quieter neighborhood, when he heard the screech. It was a sound that pierced through the hum of his engine and the muted music on his radio, a high-pitched wail of tires losing grip on asphalt, followed by the unmistakable crunch of metal meeting concrete. Samuel's foot moved to the brake before his mind fully processed what he was hearing, and he slowed the car, his eyes scanning the road ahead for the source of the noise. Then he saw it, a silver sedan, overturned and crumpled on the shoulder of the road, smoke beginning to rise from the wreckage in thin, ghostly tendrils. His heart, which had been beating with the slow, tired rhythm of an old man's resignation, suddenly kicked into high gear, adrenaline flooding his system and sharpening his senses in a way he hadn't felt in years. He pulled his car onto the shoulder, threw it into park, and was out of the vehicle before he had time to think about what he was doing. The air outside was colder than he expected, the wind off the lake cutting through his blazer and chilling his skin, but he barely noticed. He ran toward the overturned sedan, his legs pumping with a speed that surprised him, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that clouded in the night air. As he got closer, he could see the extent of the damage. The roof was crushed, the windows blown out, and the front end was so mangled it was almost unrecognizable. The smoke was thicker now, darker, and he could see the faint glow of flames beginning to lick at the underside of the vehicle. His mind raced through possibilities, through scenarios and outcomes, and he realized with a sickening clarity that if someone was inside that car, they didn't have much time. He dropped to his knees beside the wreckage, ignoring the pain that shot through his joints, and peered through the shattered window into the dim, smoke-filled interior. And there she was, Emily Darrow, the CEO's daughter, hanging upside down by her seatbelt, her face streaked with blood and soot, her eyes wide with fear and disorientation. Samuel's breath caught in his throat, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented in that moment, a life on the brink, a future hanging by the thinnest of threads. He called out to her, his voice rough and urgent, and she turned her head toward the sound, her lips moving but no words coming out. She was conscious, at least, which meant there was still a chance, still a window of time, before the flames consumed everything. Samuel reached through the broken window, his hands scraping against jagged glass, and grabbed hold of the seatbelt, trying to release the buckle, but his fingers were clumsy with panic, and the angle was all wrong. The smoke was thicker now, filling his lungs and making his eyes water, and he could feel the heat of the flames growing stronger, could hear the crackle and pop of the fire eating through metal and plastic. He pulled back, his mind racing, and looked around for something, anything, that could help him pry the door open or break through the twisted frame. His car was too far away, and he didn't have time to run back and search for tools. The flames were spreading, crawling along the undercarriage like predators stalking prey, and he knew that in another minute, maybe two, the car would be fully engulfed. He thought about the woman from years ago, the one he had held as she died, the one whose name he had never learned, and he felt a surge of determination so fierce it bordered on rage. He would not let this happen again. He would not stand by and watch another life slip away while he remained helpless. Samuel grabbed a piece of broken concrete from the roadside, hefted it in his hands, and with a strength he didn't know he still possessed, he began to smash at the remaining glass around the window frame, clearing a wider opening, creating a path through which he could reach Emily and pull her free. The glass shattered under the blows, and his hands bled from the cuts, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because stopping meant losing, and losing meant living with another ghost. Samuel's hands were slick with blood, his own, and perhaps Emily's, and the glass embedded in his palms sent sharp, electric jolts of pain up his arms with every movement, but he ignored it. Pain was irrelevant now, a minor inconvenience in the face of what was at stake. He reached through the enlarged opening, his arms stretching into the smoke-filled cabin, and grabbed Emily under her shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress as he tried to get a solid grip. She was heavier than he expected, deadweight made worse by her disorientation and the awkward angle of her position, and for a moment he wondered if he had the strength to pull her out. His back screamed in protest, the old injury from decades of sitting behind the wheel flaring up with a vengeance, but he gritted his teeth and pulled, his muscles straining, his breath coming in ragged gasps that filled his lungs with smoke and made him cough so hard he thought he might pass out. Emily's body shifted, inch by inch, her torso sliding through the window frame, even as her legs remained tangled in the wreckage of the front seat. She cried out, a sharp, broken sound that cut through the noise of the fire and the wind, and Samuel paused, his heart hammering in his chest, afraid that he was hurting her, that he was making things worse. But then he saw the flames leap higher, saw the way they were beginning to engulf the rear of the car, and he knew there was no time for gentleness. No room for hesitation. He pulled harder, his grip tightening, and he felt something give, whether it was the seatbelt finally releasing or her body breaking free from whatever had been holding it, he couldn't tell. But suddenly she was moving, sliding toward him, and he stumbled backward, dragging her out of the wreckage and onto the cold, hard ground of the shoulder. They collapsed together in a heap, Samuel on his back and Emily half on top of him, both of them coughing and gasping for air that didn't taste like smoke and death. But they weren't safe yet. The car was fully engulfed now, the flames roaring with a sound that was almost alive, and the heat was intense, a wall of scorching air that pushed against them like a physical force. Samuel rolled to his side, pulling Emily with him, and together they crawled away from the wreckage, putting as much distance between themselves and the burning car as their exhausted bodies would allow. He didn't stop until they were at least 20 feet away, and even then he kept one arm around her, holding her close as though proximity alone could protect her from the fire's reach. He looked back at the sedan, at the inferno it had become, and felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. They had been inside that just moments ago. Another 30 seconds, maybe less, and neither of them would have made it out. The thought was staggering, and he felt his hands begin to shake, the adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue now draining away and leaving him hollow and trembling. Emily stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open, and she looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and gratitude. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the sound of the flames and the distant wail of sirens that were finally approaching. Samuel leaned closer, his ear near her mouth, and heard her say, "You came back." The words didn't make sense at first. He hadn't left, hadn't gone anywhere, but then he realized she was talking about something deeper, something beyond the literal moment. She had been trapped, alone, convinced that no one would come, that she would die in that car without anyone knowing or caring, and then he had appeared, this old man she barely knew, and he had pulled her free. He had come back, not just to the scene of the crash, but to the land of the living, dragging her with him. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't a hero, that he was just a man who had been in the right place at the right time, but his throat was raw from the smoke, and his body was beginning to shut down, the exhaustion hitting him all at once like a freight train. He settled for nodding, for letting his hand rest gently on her shoulder in a gesture that he hoped conveyed what his words could not. The sirens were louder now, the flashing lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue, and within moments the first responders were there, paramedics rushing toward them with medical kits, firefighters training hoses on the burning car, police officers setting up barriers and directing traffic, Samuel allowed himself to be guided onto a stretcher, his body too tired to resist, and as they loaded him into the ambulance, he caught one last glimpse of Emily being tended to by another team of paramedics. She was alive, bloodied and battered, but alive, and that, he thought as the ambulance doors closed and the world outside faded into a blur of motion and sound, was enough. But even as the paramedics worked on him, cleaning his wounds and checking his vitals, Samuel's mind drifted back to that other crash, the one from so many years ago. He remembered the rain, the way it had pounded against the windshield in sheets so thick he could barely see, and the way the woman's hand had felt in his, cold, fragile, slipping away despite his grip. He had stayed with her until the end, had whispered words of comfort that he wasn't sure she could even hear, and when it was over, he had driven away and never spoken of it to anyone. There had been no recognition, no moment where someone said, "You did everything you could." And over the years, that silence had hardened into a belief that his efforts had been meaningless, that he had failed in the only moment that truly mattered. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had pulled Emily from the fire, had brought her back from the edge, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something. Maybe it meant that his life, with all its quiet years and invisible labor, had not been a waste. Maybe it meant he still had value, even if the world had spent decades telling him otherwise. Richard Darrow received the call at 11:30, just as he was preparing to leave the hotel and return to his penthouse overlooking the city. His assistant's voice on the other end of the line was tight with urgency, the words tumbling out in a rush that made Richard's stomach drop before he even understood what was being said. There had been an accident. Emily, Lakeshore Drive, the hospital. He didn't wait for the rest of the details, didn't ask questions that could be answered later. He simply ended the call, grabbed his coat, and strode out of the ballroom with a speed that made the lingering executives turn and stare. His driver was already pulling the car around, and Richard climbed into the back seat, barking the name of the hospital as the vehicle surged into the night. His mind was a storm of thoughts, each one darker than the last, and he forced himself to focus on the road ahead, on the lights of the city passing by, on anything other than the images his imagination was conjuring of his daughter injured or worse. When he arrived at the hospital, the scene was controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors moving with practiced efficiency, the sterile smell of antiseptic hanging in the air, the fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. Richard was directed to a private room where Emily had been taken, and when he saw her, lying on the hospital bed with bandages wrapped around her arms and forehead, her face pale but her eyes open and alert, he felt something inside him crack. He had built his entire life around control, around the ability to manage crises and mitigate risks, but in that moment, standing in the doorway of his daughter's hospital room, he felt utterly powerless. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took her hand in his, and for the first time in years, Richard Darrow allowed himself to show emotion that wasn't calculated for effect. He asked her if she was okay, and she nodded, her voice weak but steady, as she told him about the crash, about the smoke and the flames, and about the man who had pulled her free. The man. Richard's mind latched onto that detail, and he turned to the nurse standing nearby, asking who had rescued his daughter. The nurse consulted a chart, then looked up and said the name with the casual indifference of someone reporting routine information. Samuel Ortiz, the driver. Richard felt the world tilt slightly, the pieces of the evening rearranging themselves into a new configuration that he struggled to comprehend. Samuel Ortiz, the old man who had been mocked in the ballroom just hours earlier, the one Lucas Brandt had made the subject of his jokes, was the same man who had risked his life to save Emily. The irony was almost too much to process, and Richard found himself replaying the evening's events in his mind, seeing them now through a different lens. The laughter that had filled the ballroom suddenly felt grotesque, a celebration of cruelty that he had allowed to happen under his watch. He had been standing at the podium talking about legacy, while his employees mocked a man who would later prove to have more courage and integrity than anyone in that room. Richard left Emily's side only long enough to find out where Samuel had been taken, and when he was told the old driver was in another wing of the hospital being treated for smoke inhalation and lacerations, Richard made his way there immediately. He found Samuel sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, his hands wrapped in gauze, his face lined with exhaustion, and his eyes distant, as though he were somewhere else entirely. The room was small and sterile, and Samuel looked out of place in it, like a relic from a different era that had been deposited into the present without context. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. How did you thank someone for saving your child's life? How did you apologize for years of indifference, for allowing a culture where men like Samuel were treated as disposable? In the end, Richard simply walked into the room, extended his hand and said, "Thank you." Samuel looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, and he shook Richard's hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, despite the bandages. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded, and Richard could see in the old man's eyes a lifetime of being overlooked, of doing the right thing without expectation of reward. It was humbling, and Richard felt a weight settle over him, a realization that he had been complicit in a system that valued the wrong things. He had spent his career building an empire, accumulating wealth and power, surrounding himself with people like Lucas Brandt, who were sharp and ambitious and utterly lacking in the kind of quiet decency that Samuel embodied. And tonight, that decency had saved his daughter's life. Richard sat down on the chair beside the bed, and for the next hour he and Samuel talked, not as CEO and driver, but as two men who had witnessed the same fire and come away changed by it. Richard learned things about Samuel that night that he had never bothered to learn in all the years they had worked together. He learned about Samuel's family, about the two children he had raised on a driver's salary, about the wife he had lost to illness 5 years earlier, and about the dreams he had put aside in order to provide for the people he loved. He learned about the crash from decades ago, the one where Samuel had tried and failed to save a life, and how that failure had haunted him ever since. And as Richard listened, he felt a growing sense of shame, not just for himself, but for the world he had helped create, a world where men like Samuel were invisible until the moment their courage became undeniable. When the conversation finally wound down and Samuel's eyes began to droop with exhaustion, Richard stood, shook the old man's hand one more time, and made a promise. Samuel Ortiz would never be invisible again. Not in his company, not in his city, and not in his life. Richard Darrow would see to that. The story of the crash and the rescue spread through Darrow Industries like wildfire, carried by whispers in hallways and emails forwarded with subject lines like, "You won't believe this." By the time Monday morning arrived, everyone in the company knew what had happened, and the atmosphere in the office had shifted in a way that was almost palpable. The executives, who had laughed at Samuel just days earlier, now walked past his name with a mixture of shame and forced respect, and Lucas Brandt in particular seemed to have lost some of his usual swagger. He avoided eye contact in meetings, kept his comments brief, and disappeared into his office at the first opportunity, as though the walls could shield him from the judgment he felt pressing in from all sides. Richard Darrow called an all-company meeting on Tuesday, and when he stood at the podium in the main conference room, his face was grave, his voice measured, and his message clear. Heroism, he said, was not about position or title. It was about character, and character was measured in moments of crisis, not comfort. Samuel Ortiz was invited to the front of the room, and he walked up slowly, his hands still bandaged, his movements careful, as though he were navigating unfamiliar terrain. The applause that greeted him was thunderous, a standing ovation that went on for so long that Samuel felt his face flush with embarrassment. He was not a man who sought attention, who craved the spotlight, and being at the center of it now felt surreal, almost uncomfortable. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, some genuinely moved, others perhaps performing the emotion they thought was expected. He saw Emily standing near the back of the room, her arms crossed, her expression soft and grateful. Their eyes met, and she smiled. And in that smile, Samuel found something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. Validation, not of his worth as measured by others, but of the quiet truth he had carried all along, that a life lived with integrity, even in obscurity, was a life that mattered. Richard presented Samuel with a formal commendation, a plaque engraved with words about bravery and selflessness. And while Samuel appreciated the gesture, it was the conversation that followed later that truly resonated with him. Richard invited him to his office, closed the door, and offered Samuel a position overseeing driver training and safety protocols for the company. It was a promotion, a chance to step out from behind the wheel and into a role where his decades of experience could be shared with the next generation. Samuel was stunned, uncertain whether he even wanted the job. But Richard pressed on, explaining that the company needed people who understood what real service meant, who could teach others that dignity wasn't found in a title, but in the way you treated people and the choices you made when no one was watching. Samuel thought about it for a long moment, then nodded, accepting not because he craved recognition, but because he believed in the possibility of change, in the idea that maybe his story could help prevent someone else from being invisible. Emily visited Samuel at his home a week after the crash, bringing flowers and a handwritten note that thanked him in words more eloquent than she had been able to muster in the immediate aftermath. They sat on his front porch, drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing, her plans to travel, his memories of raising his children, the strange randomness of life that had brought them together in that moment on Lakeshore Drive. She told him that the crash had changed her, that she had been drifting for years, unsure of what she wanted or who she was supposed to be, but that waking up in the hospital, knowing that someone had risked everything to save her, had given her a clarity she hadn't felt before. She wanted to live a life that was worth the sacrifice he had made, wanted to find purpose beyond the expectations of her father's world. Samuel listened, nodded, and told her that the only life worth living was the one you chose for yourself, not the one others chose for you. Lucas Brandt resigned 2 weeks later, the pressure of public scrutiny and internal judgment proving too much for his carefully constructed image to withstand. Richard accepted the resignation without fanfare, and the company moved on, as companies do, the scandal fading into the background as new crises and opportunities emerged. But for Samuel, the changes were lasting. He began his new role with a quiet determination, training drivers not just in the mechanics of the job, but in the importance of seeing the people they served as human beings worthy of respect. He spoke at safety seminars, sharing his story not to glorify himself, but to illustrate a simple truth, that every life has value and every moment offers a choice to act with courage or indifference. He became, in a way he never anticipated, a symbol within the company, a reminder that worth is not measured by wealth or position, but by the content of one's actions when everything is on the line. And on quiet evenings, when the city outside his window hummed with the ceaseless energy of Chicago, Samuel would sit in his living room and think about the 2 crashes that had defined his life. The first, where he had held a woman's hand as she slipped away, and the second, where he had dragged Emily from the flames and brought her back. He had carried the weight of the first for decades, believing it defined him as a failure. But now he understood that it had been preparing him for the second, teaching him that trying, even when success was uncertain, was the only response that honored the sacredness of life. He thought about the laughter in the boardroom, about the mockery that had cut so deeply, and he realized it no longer mattered. The opinion of people who measured worth by superficial standards was irrelevant in the face of what he had done, and more importantly, in the face of who he had always been. Samuel Ortiz was a man who showed up, who did the work, who saved a life when it needed saving, and that he knew with a certainty that felt like peace was enough.